Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome back to our weekly Torah class. We are ready to begin. Torah portion is Chukat, which, if you're in the blue Scroll Chumash, it's found on page 838. If you're in any other Chumash, it's chapter 19 of the book of Bamidbar, Numbers. So the name of this week's Torah portion is actually the name of a category of commandments. What does that mean? There are many ways to subdivide the 613 commandments. The most famous way is there are positive and negative commandments. There are 248 positive commandments and 365 negative commandments. Like honor your father and mother is a positive commandment, and thou shalt not steal is a negative commandment. That's one subdivision of the 613 commandments, known as Taryag Mitzvot, the 613 commandments. But another way to subdivide the commandments is into two categories. One category is Ben Adam Lamakom, commandments between man and God, like keeping Shabbos, eating kosher, putting on a mezuzah on your door, and Ben Adam Lachavero, commandments between man and fellow man, like don't steal, don't bear false witness, don't be envious, and love your neighbor as yourself, and so on and so forth. And finally, there's a third way to subdivide the commandments into three different categories. And that is known as Mishpatim, Eidut, and Chukim. Now, notice the name of this week's Torah portion is Chukat, which is related to the third category. So first, let's explain the first two categories before we get to this week's Torah portion, which is the third category. And the order, no particular order. I happen to say Mishpatim, Eidut, and Chukim, but there is no specific order. So Mishpatim is what most people think of when they say the word mitzvah. You know, the word mitzvah does not mean a good deed. The word mitzvah means a commandment. In other words, primarily we are doing God's will. We are fulfilling his commandments, not necessarily doing a good deed. Now, of course, if you're fulfilling God's will, you're doing a good deed. But I shouldn't say most, but many Jews think that a mitzvah is a good deed. Oh, it's such a mitzvah. You did a mitzvah. But that's true only with regard to one category of commandments, which is mishpatim. Mishpatim, there are many ways to translate it. The word for mishpat can mean just or justice. It could also mean righteousness, or righteous justice. Most people would think of mishpatim as the social justice commandments. You know, a big buzzword amongst Jews is tikkun olam, fixing the world, repairing the world. And indeed, tikkun olam is a big part of the Torah, but it's only 1/3 of the Torah's commandments. 1/3 of the commandments are the mishpatim. Mishpatim are those rational, logical commandments that have a positive impact on the world around us. So caring for the poor and the needy and the downtrodden and the vulnerable and the sick and the widows and the orphans and the ill, that's all social justice, so to speak. It's making the world a better place. Standing up against racism and bigotry and injustices, yes, that's tikkun olam, and it falls under the category of mishpatim, commandments to bring justice to the world, to bring righteousness to the world. And it's 1/3 of the commandments. Now, when I say third, I don't mean, I didn't count how many commandments fall into each category, but it's one of the three pillars of different forms of commandments. But that's not all of the commandments. So, for example, putting a mezuzah on your door is a mitzvah. Well, you wouldn't say it's tikkun olam. You're not making the world, you're not repairing the world by putting a mezuzah on your door. Now, of course, every mitzvah repairs the world spiritually. But physically, when Jews think of tikkun olam, and those Jews who say, well, the goal of Judaism is tikkun olam, it's 1/3 of the goal. Don't reduce all of Judaism to tikkun olam. Judaism is much more than just social justice. And it's important, but it's only one leg of Judaism. So that is mishpatim. Mishpatim are the famous commandments. Love your neighbor as yourself. Honor your father and mother. Do not steal. Do not kill. Do not commit adultery. Do not bear false witness. And the list goes on and on. All the things that are rational commandments that preserve the order of society and the world so that it can function as a happy place, a place where everyone's rights are safeguarded and protected, and everyone is cared for and provided for, and creates a loving, just, free society. Now, the Talmud takes it so far to say that if God didn't command us some of these commandments that are under the category of mishpatim, we would actually learn it from animals, because there are different animals that can teach us different traits of behavior. Like the Talmud says, modesty from a cat. I don't own a cat. Maybe this owner owns a cat. They could comment in the chat box about cats. But apparently, cats are clean. They clean up after themselves. They're very modest. Weasels, the Talmud says, teach us how not to steal. Apparently, they don't steal from one another. In other words, what the Talmud is trying to say is they don't even have to be a human being created in the divine image with a godly soul to understand these basic laws of goodness, righteousness, kindness, decency, and morality. They are mishpatim, rational, logical, social justice commandments. Then we come to edut. Edut is the second category of commandments. Edut comes from the word witness. Mishpatim is from the word justice. Edut is a testimony, a witness. What does a witness mean? There are a group of commandments that are what we would call historical in nature, meaning they preserve some lesson, some historical event, memory of the past that we need to carry forward as Jews. So, best example, or the most obvious example, I should say, is eating matzah on Passover. Every Jew eats matzah on Passover. Why do we eat matzah on Passover? It's a mitzvah. Would you say it's tikkun olam? Are you repairing the world by eating matzah? No. Or when you when you sit in the sukkah on Sukkot, are you repairing the world? No. You're doing a mitzvah to eat in a sukkah, to eat matzah, or even keeping Shabbat every week. You're remembering that God created the world in 6 days and rested on the seventh day. It's a historical mitzvah. You're remembering that God took the Jews out of Egypt, so you eat the matzah. You're remembering that God protected us in the desert, so you sit in the sukkah. And the list goes on and on of all the various commandments that remind us of events in the past that we have to carry forward the lessons of those past experiences and memories as a Jewish heritage. So there's a long list, even putting on tefillin. Why do we put on tefillin? The primary reason is to remember the Exodus from Egypt. Even keeping Shabbat. In the Ten Commandments in Deuteronomy, it says, because God took you out and you're free, you're not a slave, and therefore you should observe Shabbat. So these are the commandments that are reminding us of historical events. Now, unlike mishpatim that are rational, self-explanatory, something that the human mind would have thought of on its own. Many societies that don't have Torah have very similar laws to preserve the ethical and moral justice of the society. So what distinguishes Jews from other nations is that we don't just do it because it's rational or logical or in the best interest of our society to function by these laws. We do it because it's a mitzvah, because God commanded us. So think about that for a second. Honor your father and mother. Well, every decent person will honor their father and mother. It makes sense. My father and mother gave birth to me, brought me into this world, raised me, showered me with their love and their devotion and care and gifts. Of course, I have a debt of gratitude, and I'm going to repay it for the rest of my life, and I'm going to honor my father and mother. But when a Jew does honoring their father and mother, it's not only because it makes sense and it's rational, but because it's in the Ten Commandments. I'm doing a mitzvah. I'm doing it because God instructed me to do it. Now, you may say, well, what's the difference? Either way, you're honoring your father and mother. There's actually a big difference. The difference is that what's if one day you're not in the mood of honoring your parents, or you got something more important that you think you need to do? Do you tell your parents, I'm sorry, but I'm not available today to help you? Or do you say, it's a mitzvah, it's a command. A command is something you have to follow. You have to make time for your parents, whether it's convenient or not, whether you're in the mood of doing it or not, whether you like it or not. Or furthermore, many times, and I'm sure you know this, from personal experiences of friends of others, maybe that you know of. But as a rabbi, I've definitely seen it time and again. There are kids who have a falling out with their parents. And they say, that's it. I'm not talking to my parents anymore. And they may think they're justified because my parent did this or didn't do that. The Torah says, no, honor your father and mother is a command. You must honor them, whether you love your parents or not. It doesn't say love your father and mother. It says honor them. Now, there are exceptions to every rule. If, God forbid, parents are abusive, emotionally, physically, and you need to cut contact, there may be a justification for it. But even then, imagine a child says, I can't talk to my parent because my parent abuses me. And every time I'm in contact with them, God forbid, they demoralize me. Okay, maybe you can't talk to them, but it doesn't mean that if they need something, you can't send it to them or provide it for them in some other way. Honoring your father and mother is a commandment. So the commandment makes sure that we do it under all circumstances. And you see, just the mind is rational, but just like you could use your rationale to conclude that you need to do a commandment, the same rationale can justify an exception to the rule. Yeah, you're not supposed to lie, but under these circumstances, I'm allowed to lie. When it's a commandment, you have to look in Jewish law. Does Jewish law allow you to lie under these circumstances? And there are times, like to make peace. If someone tells you something terrible about somebody and speaks gossip behind their back, and the other person says, what did that person say about me? Then under Jewish law, to maintain peace, you may be allowed to lie and say, oh, they didn't say anything about you. They were talking about something else. Even though it's a lie, the virtue of truth isn't as great as the virtue of peace. And in order to preserve the peace, you're allowed to tell a lie. Now, it doesn't mean you should listen to gossip. On the contrary, you should stop the person and say, it's Lashon Hara. But the point is that you can't just rely on the human mind to determine what's right or wrong. Because while, first of all, they say common sense isn't so common. But furthermore, history is replete with people who made exceptions to the rule. And the biggest tragedy, of course, was in our generation, the Holocaust, where Hitler murdered 6 million Jews, men, women, and children. And he built it around a philosophy that he indoctrinated his people with, that we need to create a pure Aryan race. And therefore, these people are subhuman and they don't deserve to live. And we're making the world a better place by getting rid of these people. And, Hitler's cabinet was made up of people with PhDs. They were very advanced intellectually. And scholarly wise, and Germany was known for its intellectualism, for its artists, musicians, the most famous composers, and yet they went along with such a twisted and demented rationale. So the human mind cannot be trusted to draw the right conclusions. Therefore, there has to be an absolute commandment from God saying, this is permissible, this is forbidden. And a Jew always references the code of Jewish law, Shulchan Aruch, to know what are the parameters, what are the contexts, what are the boundaries, what are the rules, what am I permitted to do, what am I not permitted to do. And it's guided by the mitzvah. So then we come from Mishpatim to Edut, testimonial commandments that I wouldn't think on my own to eat matzah on Passover or to eat in a sukkah on Sukkot, or to shake the lulav and esrog, or to keep Shabbat. But now that God told me, since I made the world in 6 days and rested on Shabbat, you should remember that God created the world. And that's something you have to carry with you, that the world is not a random accident that came about, without an architect and an author to life, but rather there's a God who designed and fashioned you and everything in this world. That's a daily remembrance. And every Shabbat reminds us of that. So those are the edut, the testimonials or the witnessing or the historical commandments. Now we finally come to this week's Torah portion. Chukat. Chukat is the third category of commandments known as chukim. What is chukim? Chukim is translated as super rational commandments. What does super rational commandments mean? It means that they are commandments that have a logic, have a rationale, to God, but not to us. We don't know the reason why we were commanded to do this. No human mind knows why or can comprehend it. Now, that doesn't mean that hypotheses and theses and explanations haven't been offered throughout the years. However, the Torah does not prescribe a reason. The Torah just says, do it. Now, some opinions say that there are commandments that God only gave for the sake of us fulfilling it, so that our performance of mitzvot is not limited and I use the word limited, to our rational understanding, but it's real service of God, which is even when it goes beyond our mind's comprehension. So for some examples, famous examples, is not eating milk and meat. The Torah says a Jewish diet, kosher diet, means you don't mix milk and meat. It's one of the most severe, important commandments within the context of kosher. So much so that while you're not allowed to eat pork, you're allowed to make money selling pork. A Jew can can run a ham manufacturing plant and do business and earn a profit from it. But a Jew is not allowed to have any benefit from milk and meat. So a Jew cannot have a cheeseburger joint where he runs a business selling cheeseburgers or any milk and meat products. Why can't you mix milk and meat? Torah doesn't give us a reason. Another example, you're not allowed to have a garment with wool and linen combined. Once again, the Torah doesn't give us a reason. Now, there are many, like I said, theories that have been prescribed and ascribed to these commandments, which obviously we can't get into right now. But this week's Torah portion begins with what is known as the ultimate chok, the ultimate super rational commandment, meaning only God knows its reason. We just do it because we want to be obedient and follow God's commandments. And this is known as the paraduma, the red heifer. What is the commandment of the red heifer? It's chapter 19 of this week's Torah portion. By the way, it has not been practiced since the temple times. There were 9 red heifers in Jewish history. And since the temple was destroyed and there's no longer Kohen Gadol, we do not perform it. It says Mashiach will perform it with the 10th and ultimate red heifer. What is the commandment of the red heifer? And we'll try to understand it and what it is, and then ascribe some kind of a reason and meaning to it, because like I said, every one of the chukim, there are explanations given. But because we're learning about the red heifer, we'll try to understand this particular chok. So the red heifer says as follows, that if somebody experienced a death in their family and they came into contact with a corpse and they're going through the process of bereavement, in order to become cleansed and purified, because in Judaism, a dead body, a corpse, contaminates. Not physically, obviously, but a spiritual form of defilement. And now you want to become cleansed from this defilement of coming into contact with a corpse. Incidentally, that's why a Kohen is only allowed to come into contact with 7 immediate relatives, because a Kohen has to remain in a constant state of purity. So the Torah says the following, that they should take a red heifer, para aduma. Red heifer means that it's completely red. It doesn't even have 2 black or white hairs. And it has to be a red heifer that never carried a yoke. And it should be taken by the son of Aaron, Elazar Kohen, and it's slaughtered. And then the son of Aaron should take from its blood and sprinkle it within the tent of meeting 7 times. And then he should burn the hide of the red heifer. And then he should take 2 trees. He should take a cedar tree and a hyssop and a crimson thread and put it into the fire where the hide of the animal was being burnt. And then the Kohen should take water, which is fresh living water from a river, from a living stream of water, and he should mix it in with the ashes of the red heifer, and then take this mixture of ashes and living waters from a living stream of water and sprinkle it on the person who becomes defiled because of contact with a corpse. And this will cleanse the person from his defilement, from his contamination. Now, if this sounds very bizarre, and strange, that's good, because that's the whole idea of a chok. A chok is something we cannot fathom why God would ask us to do this, and why a red heifer, and why with the crimson thread, and with the cedar tree, and the hyssop tree, and the waters, living waters, and this mixture, and how the sprinkling of these waters, like magic, like hocus pocus, somehow cleanses the person. And there are many other aspects of it that are irrational. And I don't want to say irrational, because irrational means it doesn't make sense. Irrational to our human minds, but rational to God. For example, the Kohen who cleanses the Jew became unclean. He becomes unclean in the process. So it has like a dual opposite effect. It cleanses the person who was contaminated, but contaminates the person who was clean. So this is the ultimate chok. From all of the chokim that are in the Torah, King Solomon says, I delved into the meaning of this, and it was beyond my understanding. So there's a long list of explanations to this chok. What may be, we don't know for sure, because God didn't tell us the reason. What may be one of the explanations to it. And one explanation goes along these lines. Numerous commentaries presented in different ways. But what are we talking about here? We're talking about someone who lost a loved one, and they're mourning. They're going through the bereavement process. Now, today in modern times, we have what's known as Shiva, the 7 days of mourning. And if God forbid someone who's been through mourning, they will often tell you that it is very healing and very therapeutic to go through the Shiva process. Sadly, if you're not a Jew, you could lose your loved one, God forbid, and a day or two later, you're back at the workplace, and you never had time to process or to grieve or to digest or to absorb the impact of what just happened, that your life was torn apart by the loss of your loved one. And forever, this person will never be in your life physically again. And how do you cope with that? How do you deal with that? And obviously it's very, very difficult. And in Judaism, you have 7 days and 30 days and 11 months and 12 months. And it's a process. And you can never really, ever fully recover from it, but you could learn to manage or to cope. It's like, God forbid, if someone amputates a leg or an arm, they'll never get that arm or leg back. They could just learn how to live without it. So the greatest difficulty or challenge of life, of course, is dealing with death, whether it's facing our own death, our own mortality, or the loss of loved ones. And it's one of the mysteries of life. You come from dust, you return to dust. And it leaves this fear of the unknown that every human being has to grapple with. And it's obviously very difficult. And most people don't think about it because it's so difficult unless they're forced to think about it. God forbid. But ultimately, every person is going to have to think about it. And like looking at the sun, certain things you can't look at too directly. It's too difficult to look at it. So how do we deal with that reality? And we all know the book of Ecclesiastes. King Solomon wrote a whole book about death and saying futility of futility. What's the point of life if everything you create, everything you build will come to an end? And there are many, many powerful verses in Ecclesiastes where King Solomon talks about how the wise man and the fool both perished the same way. So everything I've accumulated will be passed on to others. So what's the point of it? And obviously, it could actually lead to depression. So here's what the Torah says. What the Torah says is that the first thing is death defiles, which means being preoccupied and focused on death is a defilement of the soul. As Jews, we know what's the most famous Jewish word we love to say? L'chaim, l'chaim, always celebrating l'chaim, to life. And even on a sad occasion, like a yahrzeit, we turn it into a happy occasion. We say l'chaim. Let's not focus on the aspect of death and have a day of morbidity and depression and sadness. Let's focus on how this person's life continues to influence us, how this person's life continues to live on, how their influence and impact is felt till this day, and how to intensify that connection to the person so that their life could have more vitality and impact with the living. we always love to focus on the life force. And the fact that even when a person dies, their body dies, but their soul lives on. The soul is eternal, and not just eternal with God, but eternally connected to the loved ones, to the family, and to this world. And therefore, the goal of life is to have such a powerful impact that the continuity of your life will be felt long after you are gone. And that's the message of the red heifer. You take a red heifer. Now, the color red represents the blood. A red heifer is the power of life force. Red representing vitality and blood and life force. And the heifer represents power, animalistic power and drive, combined with the color red, which represents the ultimate life force and vitality. And you take that red heifer, you slaughter it, and you burn it and reduce it to ashes. Very much like all of life, that ultimately it decays, it turns to ashes. It ultimately rots and cannot endure. But what do we do with those ashes of this powerful red heifer? We mix it with living waters that are everlasting, that are eternal. Water represents life, human life, plant life. Everything grows and is sustained through water. The majority of the world is water. The human body is the majority water. We're born we come into this world through a sack of water. Life was formed through water. And therefore, water causes growth and life to be functional and blossom everywhere. And so taking the red heifer's ashes, which symbolizes death, and mixing it with water represents this idea of taking the death and channeling it into living waters, that the life force of the person lives on, and showing the person that life really doesn't end. It's just a new form of life, a spiritual life force that has to be connected to us who are physically alive to carry it forth. And incidentally, this idea that life is eternal and never ends, which is symbolized by the water being mixed with the red ashes, with the red heifer's ashes, just like today during Shiva. What do you do at a Shiva? The real meaning of a Shiva is to sit and comfort the mourners. And what's the best way you could comfort somebody? By talking to them and highlighting about the great impact that this person had. When you go to a Shiva house, people talk about how their lives were touched and influenced and changed and enhanced by this person. And that brings comfort to the family, because they realize that their life will go on through all the people they touched and impacted. And that's why many times when someone, God forbid, loses a loved one, they try to do some kind of a mitzvah or establish something that will perpetuate their goodness and their righteousness so that their life doesn't end. And that's what the waters mixed with the red heifer represents. Now, I just want to say one last thought on this subject, because there's many other subjects to get to in this week's Torah portion, and we've already spent a lot of time talking about the red heifer, but it's a very important commandment because it's very applicable to all of our lives. On the one hand, we think, oh, chukim, it's beyond our understanding. But besides the fact that it teaches us that our subservience and obedience to God has to go beyond our logic and understanding, we have to do what's right, even if we don't understand why, which is a very important lesson in life. But furthermore, you see, we think of ourselves, correctly so, as rational Homo sapiens, human beings who have the ability to think. And we think of our brain as the highest faculty that we possess. And while it's true on the conscious level, it's not true on the subconscious level. Yes, your brain and your mind is your highest conscious faculty, but there's something that's even deeper than your brain, and that's your soul. Now, you may call that something else. You may call it your impulses or your subconscious, whatever word you want to dress it up in. But the point is that there's a part of us that goes beyond rationale, which means there's certain things we do, or most of the things we do, because they make sense. We have a rational conclusion. But some things just run deeper We don't even understand ourselves where that feeling, where that drive, where that desire is coming from. And therefore, the Paraduma says to us that there are certain things in life you cannot process with your mind, and death is obviously one of them. You can't process that. You can't you can't comprehend it. The only way you can deal with it is by tapping into that deeper source, which is faith in God and faith in the destiny of your soul. And therefore, it's not through the rational brain that you could achieve a measure of optimism and confidence in life and its purpose. Because rationally, you could say, like, what's the point of all of this? If this is the way it all ends, why? What's the meaning of life? But only by tapping into something beyond the conscious mind, which is the idea of a chok, a commandment that connects us to God beyond our understanding. That's the answer. The answer is that you cannot solve the mystery of life with your brain alone. The mind can only go so far. At some point, you have to transcend your brain and connect with God, which is beyond, because ultimately you are a part of God, and therefore a part of you is much, much deeper than your brain. Your brain can't wrap itself around your soul. And therefore, you have to connect to God on a level that transcends even your mind. And last thought about the word chok. In Hebrew, it's beautiful. Many words have dual meanings. The word chok means super rational, or, command beyond reason. And it's that category of commandments. The word chok also comes from the word lachkok or chakika, which means engraved. And think about how perfect that is, because there are certain things that are just engraved in your soul. You know it to be true because it's embedded in your very spiritual DNA and fabric. And even if you don't understand it, it's there. It's who you are. And the most obvious thing is being a Jew. A Jew could be a Jew for all the rational reasons. But the real reason you're Jewish is because that's who you are. And that's why even a Jew who's not knowledgeable about Judaism or doesn't understand what Jewish identity is, feels Jewish and will stand up and defend and protect Judaism, and even be willing to risk his life for his Jewishness, or perform a mitzvah, even when he doesn't understand why he's doing it, but he just knows this feels right. This is who I am. I'm a Jew. I'm going to put on my tefillin. I'm going to do this mitzvah. There are many Jews who say they're atheists. They don't believe in God, but yet they go to shul on Yom Kippur, and you say, well, why are you going to shul Yom Kippur if you don't believe in God? I say, well, because I'm Jewish. And they're right. They are Jewish, and that's why they are going to shul, because being an atheist is about your brain's understanding of God. Being Jewish is much deeper. It's my soul. It's not just my brain. So that's why the word chukim, it may be the least enjoyable category of commandments, because I don't know why I'm doing it. I'm just doing it because God told me to. It's much more enjoyable to do things you feel and understand the reason. But on the other hand, it's the most liberating commandment, because it's not limiting to my brain, to my understanding. It takes me to a level that transcends what I understand and makes me realize when I eat kosher and I don't mix milk and meat, it makes me realize that I have a relationship with God which is infinite. There's a part of me which is infinite and connects to an infinite God way, way, way beyond what my limited mind can understand and process. And that's why the word chok is connected to the word engraving, because it's engraved deep into your soul. And just like that, letters that are engraved can never be erased. When you write ink on paper, you could smudge it, you could erase the ink with a pencil, you could get out an eraser, or even if it's, ink on parchment, you could scratch off the letters. But letters that are engraved in the soul, they're permanently a part of who you are, your very identity, and it can never be lost and it can never change. So that's the first and very major story in this week's Torah portion. So now we come to chapter 20. And here's another, as we would say, blockbuster mega story in this week's Torah portion, a story that's quite famous and has been discussed for thousands of years, endlessly, because it's one of the most perplexing and mysterious stories. Not mysterious in the sense that we don't understand it, but mysterious in the sense that it's hard to comprehend why something so severe would result from something that doesn't seem to be deserving of such a harsh punishment. And of course, we're talking about the story of Moshe Rabbeinu when the Jewish people arrive in chapter 20 at a place called Kadesh. And Miriam passes away there, and the water that the Jews received in the desert was in the merit of Miriam, the well of Miriam, as we know. There was a rock that produced water miraculously in her merit. There were three constant miracles: clouds of glory, which were in the merit of Aaron, the manna from heaven, which was in the merit of Moses, and the water that came in the merit of Miriam. But now she dies, and she's buried there in Kadesh, and there's no water. The water stops. And the Jews come and gather against Moses and Aaron. And they actually, the verse says, Vayarev ha'am Moshe, which means the nation quarreled with Moses. And they said, we're going to die of thirst. We have no water. Why should we perish? Why did you bring us out into the desert so we and our flock should die from thirst? Why did you take us out of Egypt to bring us to a place that does not have any seed, fig, grape, or pomegranate, and there's no water for us to drink? And Moses comes before God and falls on his face, and God appears. And here's what God says: Moses, take your staff, gather the nation, you and Aaron, and speak to the stone before their eyes, and it will produce water, and you will produce water from the rock, and you will give them and their flock to drink. What does Moses do? He takes his staff, as God told him. He gathers the nation, and he says, listen up, you rebels. Shimu nahamorim. Shall I produce water from this rock? And he lifts his staff, and he strikes the rock twice, not once, but twice. And an abundance of water begins to gush forth, and the nation and the flock drink from the water. Very next verse, God says to Moses, Moses and Aaron, you failed to trust me, believe in me. I told you, speak to the rock, and therefore you failed to sanctify my name in the presence of the Jewish people by producing water through speech. Therefore, Moses, you will not lead the Jewish people into the land of Israel. And these waters are called the waters of strife because the Jewish people contended with Hashem and quarreled with God. This is the story, chapter 20. Now, like I said, this is a story that's been discussed for thousands of years. Everyone knows the story, Moses striking the rock. And so many questions, much more than we could delve into. But I think the two big questions is, first of all, why didn't Moses listen to God? God said, speak to the rock. Why did he strike the rock? And the second obvious question is, why such a harsh punishment? Okay, he failed to speak to the rock. He struck the rock, but this is so terrible that God says, that's it. I'm done. You're no longer going to be the leader of the Jewish people. You're not going to cross over to the land of Israel. We know that Moses pleaded with God to rescind this decree. His dying wish was to go into Israel. After all, he took the Jews out of Egypt, led them for 40 years. He wanted to see the culmination of his life's efforts. But tragically or sadly for Moses, God says, no, you're not going. You could go to the mountain, look at the land, but you cannot enter into the land of Israel. And the question is, why was God so harsh, so unforgiving of Moses, that he would not allow him to go into the land of Israel just because of this mistake? And what's interesting is, we know there was another major sin the Jews committed in the desert, and that was the worshiping of the golden calf. And if anything, that was a much worse sin. They betrayed God and worshipped another God 40 days after they got the Torah. Here, the Jews complained, they were thirsty. Okay, they're fetchers, they're discontents. Not as bad as the golden calf. And yet God forgave that sin. But here, we know that by the golden calf, Moses came down and he smashed the tablets. Here, he didn't smash any tablets, he just struck a rock. For smashing the tablets, he's not punished. Not only that, a rabbi's comment that he was praised for that. But for hitting a rock, he gets such a harsh punishment. And as I said, there are many, many interpretations to this. The most famous one, perhaps, is the interpretation of Maimonides. Maimonides says something very powerful that's applicable to all of us, and that is that the punishment of Moses was not for hitting a rock. Hitting a rock is not a terrible sin. The punishment of Moses was for losing his temper. When he picked up his staff and struck it, it was done in anger. Where do you see that? He says, listen up, you rebels. And then he strikes the rock. And God gave him a chance to realize he's making a mistake. The first time the water didn't come out, he had to hit it twice. And therefore, the message was, Moses, you may be a great leader, but once you start losing your temper at the people, basically you're no longer qualified to lead the Jewish people. And from this perspective, it's not a punishment, it's just the reality. 40 years earlier, Moses was in an identical situation back in the book of Exodus. And there, God did tell him to hit the rock. Now, 40 years later, he says, speak to the rock. What's the difference? The difference is that generation came out of slavery. All they knew was force. So the metaphor of hitting the rock was through power, through might. But this is a free generation. They were born in the wilderness. They never experienced slavery. You can't hit them. You have to speak to the rock. Even though the rock looks hard and stubborn and difficult, like these challenging Jews who are quarreling with him, ungrateful, never satisfied, losing faith so quickly, speak to them, draw out their waters. And all of us can relate to this, when it comes to education, whether children or students. You can't beat somebody into submission. Now, beating, of course, I don't mean literally, but I mean even forcing somebody. You could try to control somebody and force them and manipulate them. That may work for a little while. Ultimately, you have to learn how to speak to someone to draw out their internal waters, that it shouldn't be from the outside in, but from the inside out. And so God says to Moshe Rabbeinu, you're like that great teacher. I'm sure you had those teachers who, when they started their career, they were young and patient and understanding. Then when they got older, they lost their patience. They weren't so understanding. Their temperament changed. And the school says it's time to retire. You're a great teacher, but the new times require a new generation. And leadership is very much about timing. And the right leader in one generation, as we know, could be completely wrong for the next generation. And that's what God was telling Moshe Rabbeinu. And therefore, the punishment was not, first of all, Moses was held to a higher standard, a higher level, obviously. But the punishment was not as a result of hitting a rock, but it was rather because he lost his temper. And what the Torah is teaching us is that the greatest sin that Moses committed, the one that permanently barred him entry to the land of Israel, was losing his temper, anger. Today we have something called anger management. And it's a wonderful thing, because if you can't manage your anger, your life will self-destruct. People who have short fuses are people who cannot enter into any meaningful relationships with others, because people are always afraid of them. God forbid if somebody's married to a person with a temper or has a boss that has a temper, you're living in constant fear of the person, and therefore you're afraid to get close to the person. So therefore it destroys all of your relationships. And furthermore, the Talmud says when a person's angry, so the divine presence departs from the person. Someone once told me that the word anger is one letter away from danger. Just put a letter D before anger and you have danger. You could do terrible things when you're angry. It's tragic. Sometimes people commit terrible crimes out of anger. They call it crimes of passion, right? So anger can destroy the person's entire mind and take them to very dark and terrible places. And the Talmud takes it a step further. The Talmud says whoever gets angry, it's as though they worship idols, because it shows a lack of faith in God. Why are you getting angry? You should accept what God did. And even if it came through someone else's choice, if it wasn't meant to happen to you, it could not have happened to you. And therefore, it's a lack of trust in God. It's idolatry, not just getting angry. It's worshiping idols, getting angry. So controlling your anger. And the Maimonides says that you should always take the middle path in life. Maimonides believed in the golden means, the Shvil HaZahav, the golden path. He said, don't go to either extreme. So for example, a person who's a coward is afraid of everything. So he's a coward. It's terrible to be a coward because you never achieve anything. You're always afraid. Another person who has no fear, that's not good either, because then you'll do things that are foolhardy, because you don't take into account what the consequences might be. So you need to take the middle path. Even humility, Maimonides says, take the middle path. Be humble, but don't be so excessively humble that you allow people to take advantage of you. There's one trait that Maimonides says you have to go to the far extreme, and that's anger. He says a person should not have any anger whatsoever, because any form of anger is negative. There's no room for anger. And even in Jewish law, I mentioned earlier, they always have to check Jewish law about when you're allowed to do something or not. Jewish law says the only time you're allowed to be angry is if you're doing it sometimes to discipline a child. You can pretend like you're angry to deliver the message in an impressionable way, but internally you have to be at peace with. You have to be calm, and if you're not calm, don't speak those words, because you'll misrepresent. If you say it out of anger, it will not be received. No one responds to anger, and therefore anger is trying to control a situation rather than realize that things are not in your control. Hashem controls it, and you have to be able to accept circumstances rather than get angry. And therefore Moses' sin was the sin of anger. But now the question is, why did Moses sin? Why didn't Moses follow God's instructions? After all, God said, speak to the rock. Did he miss those words? Why didn't he follow God's instructions? And again, 40 years earlier, God told him to hit the rock. He followed what God asked him to do. This time he said, speak to the rock. He didn't follow. Why didn't he follow what God said, told him to do? And a very interesting insight given by Rabbi Jonathan Sachs is as follows. If you look at the verses, you find something very interesting. I'm going to read the story again. The Jewish people arrived in a place called Kadesh. It actually says when they arrived as well, in the first month. And then there's a few words that are snuck in. And Miriam, his sister, died there, and she was buried there. And then there was no water for the people, and everything follows that. So the simple reading is, well, Miriam died, and therefore the water dried up. And because there was no water, the next crisis ensued where the Jews started to complain because there was a lack of water. But Rabbi Jonathan Sachs says something else. He says, maybe the reason why Moses was not able to follow through on God's instruction is because, as the Torah said, his sister had just died, and his sister Miriam was buried there. You see, Moses had one brother and one sister, but this sister was no ordinary sister. This sister was the one who watched over him when his mother put him in the Nile, when Yocheved put him in the Nile. And when the daughter of Pharaoh came to the river and saw the baby crying, she intervened and spoke to the daughter of Pharaoh and was able to arrange for the baby to go back to his Jewish mother for nursing until he was returned to the palace to be raised as a prince in Egypt. Moses' whole identity, his whole life, his whole identity as a Jew is because of that interaction and that intervention of his sister Miriam. And Miriam was a great prophetess. She led the Jewish people as well. After Moses sang the song of the sea, she led the women in song. And remember, she spoke gossip about her brother, even though it was a sin and she was punished. She was so instrumental and devoted to him and so concerned that when she saw him separate from his wife, she went to talk to Aaron. So you see that Miriam was a huge influence in the life of Moses. And now Moses loses his beloved sister. And remember the beginning of the class, we talked about the red heifer and the whole idea of bereavement and how we deal with loss and tragedy and losing a loved one and the gaping hole that leaves in your life. And as a result of that, it can lead to depression. And that's why the paradumas helps the person rehabilitate themselves from that depressing mindset to realize life has continuity. But perhaps the Torah is telling us as a prelude to the story what led to that. And that was the loss of his beloved sister. What the Torah is telling us is something very powerful. That obviously Moses was going through a tumultuous, painful time in his life. He lost his beloved sister. But more than just a sister, he lost his best friend or confidant. You know, they say leadership is a lonely job because in order to be a leader, you have to be out front. You have to be ahead of everyone else. Someone said something very clever that a leader always has to be like 20 or 30% ahead of everyone else. That's what it means to lead. You show people a way that they haven't seen yet. You have a vision. But you can't get too far ahead because if you're 70% ahead of everyone else, then they'll say you're a mashugana, you're crazy. You may just be too far ahead of your times. But by definition, a leader is someone who's ahead of everyone else. So he doesn't have camaraderie necessarily, because he sees something and everyone else may be fighting him because no one likes change. So people don't want to change. And you're going out there and trying to bring about change and no one sees what you see and you have to lead by yourself. So it could be very lonely. But the greatest leaders need at least one close confidant that they could trust in. Now, the definition of a confidant is somebody who is a trusted friend, a person that you could share your deepest thoughts and feelings and fears with, and trust that person implicitly. And that is what every great leader needs. Now, it could be your spouse, it could be your wife, it could be a friend, it could be anyone, a sibling, but at least one person that you can confide in truthfully and wholeheartedly. Perhaps Moses' confidant, says Rabbi Sachs, was Miriam. And the passing of Miriam made him feel very vulnerable. And as a result of that, he lost his confidence and he lost his faith in his own ability to lead and his faith in the people. And therefore, one of the commentaries says his sin was not that he reprimanded the people, listen up, you rebels, because after all, sometimes the leader has to reprimand people. But he first should have spoken to the rock, produced the water, quenched their thirst. And only after performing this miracle of speaking to the rock and producing the water and showing them the power of God, then he should have reprimanded them. Then he should have spoken to them. And I think that's a very powerful lesson in life, that if you need to reprimand somebody, if you need to reprove somebody, first take care of their needs. First, show them the greatness of God, inspire them with something, and then they'll be more receptive. It wasn't that Moses reprimanded them, but as that he did it in the order of first reprimanding them and then providing them with the water. And so these are very timeless, eternal, valuable lessons. First lesson, obviously, is not to lose your temper. Nothing positive comes out of losing your temper. The greatest consequence that Moses faced in his life was not for smashing the tablets. That was necessary. The Jews had committed a terrible sin, and he didn't do it out of anger. He did it out of a way of demonstrating to Jewish people how far astray they have gone, and using this as a way to reapproach the Jewish people with God. But anger and losing your temper could lead to the greatest consequences in your life. But furthermore, we all go through periods of life that we feel weakened or vulnerable, like Moses after losing his beloved sister. But those are the moments that we have to recognize that, as difficult and as challenging as it may be, we still have to have faith in God and realize that God is always our closest confidant. As King David says, even if my father and mother have forsaken me, abandoned me, the Lord will gather me in. We always have Hashem. And on the other hand, I think it's important to know that sometimes when you meet people who are angry or lose their temper or are frustrated, rather than retaliate with more anger, which just leads to a cycle of anger and violence and frustration and aggression, look at them and think, what are they going through in their life that's making them so unsettled, that's causing them to act in this irrational way, resorting to anger? And if you view people through that lens, rather than being angry at them for being angry, you'll try to have compassion and pity and mercy and understand what are they going through. And, the King Solomon, the book of Proverbs says, a soft response turns away anger. So when you respond with kindness, with gentleness, that will calm them and make them realize that there's no need to get angry. And anger is not the answer. It's not the solution. As Maimonides says, you should go to the furthest extreme away from anger, because anger is a very detrimental characteristic. And rather, instead of getting angry at the person who got angry at you, substitute anger for mercy and compassion. And instead of responding with hate, respond with love. And I'll just tell you a quick story. I think it's found in Stephen Covey's book, 7 Habits of Highly Effective People. And he tells this story that there was a woman in Manhattan, got on the train. It was the winter. She was wearing an expensive fur coat. And this father gets on the train with 3 rambunctious, rowdy, wild children. And the father sits down on the train. If you've ever been on the New York subways, everyone sits there, daydreaming, whatever they're thinking about. But the kids are running around on the car, making a ruckus, screaming, fighting, yelling. And the woman is trying to read a book, and these kids are making a tumult. And she keeps on looking at the father, like waiting for him to get up and tell his kids to sit down and behave and discipline them. But the father just sits there oblivious. And then the kids start jumping on the seats. And it was a snowy day. It snowed in New York a few days earlier, and the streets were like wet with dirty old snow. And one of the kids with his shoe steps on her coat that was on the seat, next to her, and puts a big footprint right on her fur coat. At this point, the woman starts yelling at this man. What is wrong with you? Your kids are out of control, and you're just sitting here daydreaming. What kind of father are you? And she starts to reprimand him in front of everyone on the train. The father jumps up, I'm so sorry, I feel terrible. And he tries to wipe off the coat. It's filthy. He says, look, I apologize. I'll pay for the dry cleaning. No problem. I'm really, really sorry. And then he says, I'm sorry, but the reason I'm so lost is because I'm going through a very difficult time. He says, my wife just last week died of cancer. And she was a young woman. She was battling cancer, and I lost her. And I have these 3 children. I leave work early. I take them up, pick them up from school. I take them home, and I try to take care of them. And they're out of control now because they're missing their mother, and they're lost, and they're confused, and I'm lost, and I'm depressed, and I can't handle this. And I was just thinking about my wife, and I was lost in my thoughts, and I didn't realize what my kids were doing, and I'm so sorry. And the woman hears this, and she goes, I'm so sorry to hear that you lost your wife. Here, let me help you with the kids. And she says, kids, come over. And all of a sudden, she's sweet and kind and loving. She says, look what I got in my pocketbook. And she starts taking out candy to give the kids. And Stephen Covey says, what happened? This woman was furious. She was ready to strangle this guy. She hated him. She thought he was the worst human being in the world, the lousiest father. And in an instant, she became the most loving, kind, compassionate, caring woman who wanted to help the man and help the children. And the answer is obvious. What happened was she came to the realization what this man is dealing with. And now she understood what it was all about. And the message is, when somebody is not acting the way you would like them to act, rather than get angry, try to think, what's going on here? Or if someone gets angry, why are they so angry? You ever driving on the road and you make a little mistake? I don't know, you forgot to put on your blinker or some fool, and someone starts screaming, and you're like, why is this guy so angry? Okay, fine, I made a mistake, but why are you on the verge of losing it over such a minor little thing? When you see people with short fuses, that any little thing creates an eruption, like a volcanic eruption, they explode over nothing. It's like they say the car is 0 to 60 in 5 seconds. Like there is a time when, something can happen that it's justified maybe to get angry, but just people who, jump. So rather than get angry and reciprocate with anger, realize that like Moshe Rabbeinu, anger could be one of the worst traits and cause the gravest consequences. Things that are said in anger can never be taken back. God forbid, in relationships, if somebody says something in anger, the words were spoken. It's very hard to undo it, so to speak. And most of all, it destroys your own soul. It destroys your own equilibrium and your own inner peace. And therefore, by strengthening your faith and trust in God, even Moses, when he lost his beloved sister, was perhaps prone to this. We have to make sure under all times to know that whatever happens in life, Hashem is with me, and therefore I should always walk with trust, with confidence, with security, and with serenity. Wishing everyone a beautiful day. If you have any questions, we'll take a minute for any questions in the chat box. And looking forward to a wonderful Shabbat. So true, Rabbi. Be careful in the manner you relate to people because you never know what they're going through, right? So Scott said, acting angry with kids is teaching by example to use anger. That's very true. Obviously, when you are angry, but again, there may be, we all remember that time when we ran into the street to chase a ball and our parents yelled at us and said, don't ever run into the street. And they were really angry. Well, maybe that's justified because if you want to really, you can't just say, look, it's not really good to run into the street. You could get hit by a car, God forbid. You want to really impress upon the kid. Don't ever go in the street. You could get killed, You want to shock the kid. It's like Moses smashing the tablets. Like, okay, this is it. Wake up. You need to be shocked out of your, it's like God forbid someone has a heart condition, a heart attack, and the heart's not working. You need the defibrillator to like shock the system. Maybe like smashing the tablets. There are times where it's warranted. The problem here is it wasn't warranted. Okay, they quarreled. They were unhappy with the water. It's like your kids are complaining about something and you blow up and start screaming at them. They didn't commit a golden calf. They didn't commit idolatry. Like it has to be justified. So there may be some cases, but you're right. If a child sees that a parent deals with everything through anger, screaming at this one, screaming at that, all they know how to do is use anger as a tool, then you're teaching them to deal with every problem with anger. And as King Solomon says, anger just perpetuates more anger. A calm response, a loving response will be able to turn away the anger. So wishing everyone a beautiful day. Thank you for joining, and we'll hope to see you soon. Shabbat Shalom. If we don't see you tomorrow, we're having Wisdom on Worth. If you're in town and you want to come to Worth Avenue, we're learning about the art of happiness from 12 to 1 at Daniele's Gallery. You're welcome to come to Palm Beach and join us for that wonderful class on happiness, and lunch is provided. Thank you again and have a wonderful day, everyone. Bye-bye.